in verse 14, in the day of prosperity be joyful, in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So here's a difficult circumstance for them, and yet all according to God's providence. And it just reminds us that there are common struggles that the believer faces in life that are common with others that have gone before. And yet, we still have the same promises that they've had. Because what else do you see reiterated, especially in verses 2 to 4? What does that sound like? Think Abraham. Yeah, land seed blessing. So the LSB, right? Land seed blessing. This is a reiteration of the Abrahamic covenant, right? Chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. We won't read those, but essentially the same reiteration of what God had told Abraham. Many similarities there. Also, Isaac receives what we call a theophany. God appeared to him, verse 2, Yahweh appeared to him and said, and then he tells him not to go down to Egypt, and he doesn't. He obeys. But he tells him, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. And that introduces a major theme in this section of God's presence. We'll kind of make note of this a little bit later in the passage. I just wanted you to see it there. I'll be with you, God's presence. And then the reiteration of what he said to Abraham, for to you and to your offspring, to your seed, I will give all these lands. So there's the promise of a people, a place, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I'll multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So this program to bless the nations through the seed of Abraham. So here are the same promise given to Isaac, same passed down. So what's amazing, someone pointed this out, Isaac has the same problems that Abraham has, but he also has the same promises that Abraham has. And I love that comparison because that's true for us. We have some of the same problems that everyone has experienced, people of God, and yet we share some of the same promises that they do as well. So here's God's faithfulness to keep his promises, reiterate these. And then look at verse 5. Verse 5 is really significant, actually, because of the language that's used. Because here, Abraham's obedience. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. If you actually go over to Deuteronomy chapter 11, and Deuteronomy 11 kind of closes out the first major section of Deuteronomy, and 12 to 25 is the next major section. But Deuteronomy 11, this is in context of giving the reiteration of the Mosaic law. Deuteronomy 11:1, you shall therefore love Yahweh your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always. This is like a direct connection, direct parallel to that language. It's very specific language. And so, obviously, the Mosaic law has not been given yet. So it's not saying that Abraham's keeping the Mosaic law as it was given, but it's saying he was an obedient man. Because that same language of obedience to God and his law, which was revealed up to that point for Abraham, he had kept it. So the emphasis is on the obedience, the complete obedience of Abraham. Of course, we know disobedience in his life, but when you look at the things, the commands throughout, there's a number of them that Abraham was called to do. You see Abraham following God in faith. And so you see here this final emphasis on obedience. So there's the problems that they share, the promises that they share, and then the obedience that they share, because in verse 6, so Isaac settled in Gerar. And that's kind of a passing statement, but what does that tell you that Isaac did? He obeyed, right? Just like Abraham. So Abraham, the one who received the covenant, he obeys. Isaac, who receives the same covenant, he obeys. And so that's the emphasis the text is making. I like what Bruce Waltke said in his commentary. He says, in faith, Abraham went out, chapter 12, verse 4. In faith, Isaac now remains, and he stays in the land. We might think of jumping ahead in history quite a bit, light speed, and going to Galatians, and we see how these promises in part relate to us. Galatians 3, verse 16. It says, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring." It does not say, "and to offsprings," referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. And Paul's actually likely quoting from Genesis 22:18 here, where it actually does. Usually offspring or seed is used in the plural in Genesis, but there is an instance in Genesis where it refers to a singular individual, the Messiah, even in Genesis. And so Paul seems to be quoting that passage. But he's saying we are included in these promises because of this one who would come from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, and he would bring this blessing to us so that we could experience these promises as well and be included. So we share as well some of these same promises and the implications of them. There's a side application someone pointed out. I think it's just helpful to see and meditate on. We're going to see in this passage, on the one hand, you don't have to repeat the same things as your parents, right? Abraham goes down to Egypt, but God stops Isaac and he listens. He doesn't go down to Egypt. And yet, you may also fall into the same sins as your parents, especially your father, because that's exactly what Isaac's about to do here. So we might say that parenting is very influential, but it's not always determinative. So we see here that theme of the influence of a father, because here Isaac is going to follow after his father. And so here, first point, God's promises reiterated. God's promises reiterated. Before we move on to the next one, any thoughts there? Questions related to this first section? While I get a drink. Okay. God's protection then revealed, verses 6 to 11. God's protection revealed, verse 7 rather. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he feared to say, "my wife," thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought, lest I die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Deja vu again. Here's the same sin that Isaac repeats that his father committed twice. Actually, Abraham probably committed the sin more than twice, because it actually indicates earlier in Genesis that this was his pattern. This was the pattern of Abraham. This was his modus operandi, where he would regularly do this. We just have two of them especially recorded in Abraham's life, in chapter 12, verse 13, and then 20, verse 13. And we've looked at those in the past. Here we see like father, like son. And this is now the third time in Genesis that the sister lie, or the wife-sister lie, comes up. And it happens. And you're like, what? Why does this keep on happening? How do these kings keep falling for this? And he calls her his sister. Isaac's wife is attractive, it tells us, similar to Sarai. And this would get Isaac off the hook, but it would put Rebekah in danger. So you see here, just as a side footnote, it's like husbands are to protect their wives. This is what it means to be a man, to be a protector. And yet here is Isaac putting his wife into great danger by his lie to protect himself. Of course, Christ is the ultimate husband of the bride, and he gives his life and lays it down for the bride. So we see Isaac here fearing, and that's what's driving him here, driving him in his decisions, his fear. It's good to think about fear for a moment here and how it can lead to other sins. Fear of man is a snare, Proverbs say. And it's good for us to think, what ways has fear or is fear causing me to sin either in my speech, in my behavior, in my actions? Maybe we exaggerate something or we make evasive comments because we're afraid of what will happen if we tell the truth, or we do certain things because we are afraid of what might happen. Fear often can lead to other sins because fear really reveals to us what we love, right? We fear losing what we love, so we seek to protect it. Maybe it's a certain reputation that we have. Maybe it's a certain thing that we prize, and so we love that thing so much that we fear losing it. I think with your family, your loved ones. You fear the loss of them because you love them, because you cherish them. This is actually somewhat helpful in that when we think about fear of God for a believer. I think it speaks to the greatest intensity of our love for God. We so don't want to displease God and sin against him because we have such an intensity of love for God. This is why the psalmist says, with you there is forgiveness of sins that you may be feared, which doesn't seem to fit for us. But if we understand that we're rightly related to God and we love him so intensely, that's the essence of what this fear is. But on the sinful side, our fears can often lead us to lying, to other sinful actions. And so the result is the solution is we have to fight fear with fear. So we have to fear God more than we fear whatever that thing is. And that seems to be what the scripture constantly holds out to us, to have God as your fear. Jesus says, don't fear those who can kill the body, which is exactly what Isaac is afraid about, but fear him who can kill both soul and body in hell. That is the one whom you should fear. And so Isaac is gripped by his fear here, fear for his life. And so he lies to protect himself. Daniel 11:32 has this little statement here that just is kind of almost a parenthesis, and it's a great little line. It says, the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Those who know their God shall stand firm and take action. In contrast to fear of men, those who know their God. So here's the thing about Isaac. He had lots of reasons not to fear. He had just been given the promise of Abraham. He had been told that his line is the line of Messiah, the line of the seed of the woman. This individual is going to come from him. And so he knows he and his wife have to be protected because this promise has to come to fulfillment. God is faithful. There's no way they can be lost. God is going to protect them. And yet Isaac finds a way to circumvent God's protection. He forgets that, and he seeks to protect himself by lying instead of trusting God here. Far better to die trusting God than to lie, not trusting God. I mean, it's so extreme in our minds, but it's like, well, what is better? Lying to preserve your life or telling the truth? What's the worst that could happen? You could die, right? God could allow you to die. And that might be God's plan, but far better to obey the Lord and tell the truth. So Isaac has just been reminded of the promise of God, and yet here he struggles to believe that. Now, this is a fun passage because you go, what is going on here? Now, it's interesting because Yahweh doesn't always work the same way, and there's just a refreshing nature to him that he doesn't always do it exactly the same. Though these are the same sins, for Pharaoh, when Abram did this, he had a revelation from God that he was going to kill him because Abraham Pharaoh was about to take Sarai, and so he warns him directly. But that's not how God works with Abimelech here. With this Abimelech, just as a footnote, Abimelech is probably a throne name. I mean, it is possible this is the same guy, but it's maybe a little bit more conceivable that Abimelech is like Pharaoh or Caesar. It's a throne name that you take, and Philcol later is probably the same. So this is probably a later king in that same line. But here, what happens is he doesn't find out by a direct revelation of God. He finds out by the providence of God. He happens to be just walking around, and he looks out his window, and he sees Isaac and Rebekah in the distance, and they're laughing together. That's what it says. It's actually a play on words because Isaac's name means laughter. So laughter is laughing with his wife. And the King James Version says they were sporting. They were sporting. One commentator suggested that they were horsing around, or he even said making out. But the idea, the LSB translates it as caressing. And so whatever it is, this is clearly something that you don't do with your sister. This is something that you do with your wife. And that's the point, that Abimelech is going, wait a minute, they are not brother and sister. That is this man's wife. And he sees that, and God allows him to witness that and to see it. It's actually used, the same word is used in Exodus 32, verse 6, when Moses comes down from the mountain, and it says that, Israel's worshiping the golden calf, and it says they were eating and drinking, and they rose up to play, or they rose up to laugh. That's the same word here. Now, it has a big, broad range. It can mean mocking. It can have this sexual connotation to it, and that seems to have what it has here in this passage. So God reveals this, and Isaac had kept this secret for a long time. It says that he was in the land for quite a long time before this was revealed. And yet, how sad is it that a pagan ruler exposes the sin of this believer? Pagan ruler exposes the sin of this believer. It is a reminder to us, be sure, the proverb, be sure your sin will find you out. And we always want to be exposing our sin so that God doesn't expose our sin for us. Proverbs 28:13 speaks about this very thing, and the blessing and need to deal with our sin. Proverbs 28:13, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. It's like we reveal them, God covers them. We cover them, God exposes them. A friend of mine in California, he told this story once about how he was out of town and he was just kind of on this road trip, and he just stopped in a random restaurant to eat, and it was really far away from where he lived. And he sits down at a booth and gets some food, and then as he's leaving, he sees someone he knows. It's a friend of his, a guy he knows that lives near him and in church. And but then he sees another woman in the booth, and it's not his wife. And he goes up to him and it's like, hey, who's this? Where's your wife? And it turns out the guy was committing adultery with this woman, and he thought, I'm going to get really far away. I'm going to go somewhere so random that no one will possibly be able to find out that we're having this relationship. And my buddy is randomly stopping in at this restaurant, and there he finds out what's going on, and his sin was exposed. And it's good when our sin is exposed, but we want to be the ones that do it. So God providentially allows this king to discover this and expose the sin of Isaac here. And yet, nevertheless, though Isaac is sinning, God protects the chosen line through this pagan king, through his providence. He protects them. It is a reminder to us, big picture, that how easy it is for sinful patterns and habits to be passed down from parent to child. When it says in Exodus that I'll visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children, that idea is not probably a genetic idea, but it's an influence idea. That the idea is if the father acts in one way, whatever he prioritizes or whatever he practices will often have a significant influence on his children and grandchildren, for better or for worse. That's the idea, I think, of that sins of the father idea. It's not determinism, but it is the result of influence. And that's certainly what we see here. This is what Isaac had witnessed his father doing time and again, and he follows after that, and it's exposed. And yet God protects his people. God's protection revealed. All right. Number three, God's provision received. God's provision received in verses 12 to 22. Look at verse 12. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. Yahweh blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." And just notice this, the word great is used a number of times here. It's repeated, I think, 3 times. It emphasizes that Isaac is becoming greater and greater. God is blessing him. Remember, Abram, he's just growing and growing in blessing as God promised, and Lot is benefiting in the overflow from that, but it causes them to have to leave. There's conflict between Lot and Abram as a result of this prosperity in Abram's life. And then now you see Isaac experiencing some of the same thing, and his prosperity is so great, his possessions, it says that he has 100-fold yield, which is incredible, especially if this is a time of famine. And he is just, insanely prosperous because the hand of God is upon him as being in the line of promise. But it causes jealousy, as prosperity often does. And the Philistines envy him, and they start doing this really terrible thing. They start to fill in his wells, the wells that were Abraham. So there was this kind of pact between Abraham and the Philistines, which they seem to have believed that had expired at the death of Abraham, because now they're filling in these wells that were Abraham's. And just imagine that, maybe you're on a well and someone just shows up and just fills it, dump trucks a bunch of dirt into it and fills up your well and it's gone. You're like, what in the world? This is like sabotage to Isaac. And that's what they're doing here. And so we see very similar to the conflicts that Abraham has. Then we see further conflict over these wells in verse 17 to 22. So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. Sitnah is actually related to the word accuser. It's like a word for Satan. And verse 22, and he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now Yahweh has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." Okay, so a couple things here. Wells are incredibly significant. You don't drink, you die. It's in the Middle East here. This is so significant. Water is contested over all the time because you can't have a city, you can't live anywhere that doesn't have a regular stream of water, regular supply of water. And so these Philistines have filled in many of these wells of Abraham. And then so Isaac starts to redig them. And what does he name them? He names them the same thing that Abraham named them. It's like he's saying, this is my ownership. I own these lands. I mean, just imagine if there was some construction going on and there was a field that got cleared and I just walked in and I put a big sign, Robertsville, it's like whatever. I remember the old Christopher Reeve Superman movie, Superman 1, and Lex Luthor's plan is to have some rockets hit the San Andreas Fault and to cause California to fall into the sea, into the Pacific. And then he buys up all the desert land that's like not worth anything because it's now going to be the beachfront. And then he has all these like areas, regions in this new part of the desert that's the beachfront, and it's called like, Luthersville and things like that he names after, and his henchman is named Otis. And so Otis like writes in Sharpie marker in one of the things, Otisville. And Luther's like, "What is Otisville? What is this?" And he's like, "Oh, it's Otisville." He's like, "Oh," he gets all upset at him, but he's like, it's a little place. It's a little place. He just wants his little place named after him. Well, that's what Isaac's doing here. He's naming all these places to show his ownership of the land. Esek, contend, Sitnah, accusation, maybe not the best names for your twins, and contend and accusation, or maybe they are good names. I don't know. And then he digs a well where there's no argument over it. No argument. And he calls it Rehoboth. I don't know if you've been to Rehoboth Beach. I have in New Jersey, I think. And Rehoboth means wide open spaces, or giving him space. It's actually used in the Psalms to speak about how God gives this relief and providing space. And it gets picked up there. And, maybe you have place names that have really sweet memories, or maybe they remind you of bad memories, and some place names remind you of good memories. And that's here. He names these wells because of what happened there. And Rehoboth is like a memory that is a good memory. It is how God provided for them. And I hope you have things like that in your life, like whether they are just tangible things or places or memories that remind you back, God gave space. God provided. This is so clear in my mind. And of course, God provides every day for us, but there's some times when it's especially memorable, and we want to highlight those things. And so here he calls this place Rehoboth because God has provided for Isaac here. And we see this happen time and again in the biblical storyline. Okay, we got to hurry. Last point, God's presence recognized. God's presence recognized. First, it's recognized by Isaac and then by the nations. And we'll just read this and make a few comments. Verse 23, from there, he went up to Beersheba, and Yahweh appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not. For I am with you. There it is again. I'm with you, and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of Yahweh and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. So here God appears to him. He assures him of his presence. And what does Isaac do? He worships God. And he builds this altar and worships. Then the nations recognize the presence of God in the life of Isaac. Verse 26. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his advisor, and Philcol, the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you? They said, we see plainly that Yahweh has been with you. There it is again. Yahweh's with you. They see it. It's undeniable. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. This is the same thing that happened with Abraham. And you will do to us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good and have sent you away in peace. I mean, this is hilarious negotiating tactics. Oh, because we've always done good to you, like except for filling in the wells. What? You are now the blessed of Yahweh. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning, they rose early and exchanged oaths, and Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. He called it Sheba. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. Just want to highlight one thing. This section of Genesis 26 to 36, the Isaac, Jacob narrative, one of the major themes is God's presence. And I'll show it to you just by repetition. The phrase with you or with us, God being with you or with us, is used 2 times in chapters 12 to 25. In chapters 26 to 36, in chapters 37 to 50, the final chapters of the book, it's used 1 time. But in chapters 26 to 36, it's used 11 times. And so this keeps on coming up. I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And certainly a key theme in Scripture. And we've already seen in the beginning of the chapter and in Isaac's life and recognition, and now even the nations recognize this. And what we see here already is the pattern that's going to develop as nations come and they bless the chosen people because of God's presence with them. And we see nations coming to Israel and her kings later in the millennium and to worship Jesus, and as Israel is a servant to the nations. And the Queen of Sheba is an early recognition of this as well. Notice that they call it Beersheba, and she comes and she makes a similar statement in 1 Kings 10 verse 9 about how God has been with Solomon as well. So here we are. We have some of the same challenges that every believer has, and yet some of the same promises. Let me just summarize this whole section. One commentator put it like this: the problems are the same and the promise is the same. The peril is the same and the protection is the same. The pressures are the same and the provision is the same. And the place is the same and the peace is the same. And then it says, all that God gave to Abraham, he gives to Isaac. God's gifts are not determined by your prominence. So there's a good reminder. If I had to put another word in this whole chapter, it would be same. Sameness, right? We have the same experiences in many ways and the same promises and provision and presence of God to go through them. So let me pray. Lord, thank you for our time running through this chapter. Hopefully we've been able to see some of the major headings here and some of the major points that are being shown to us, Lord. What an encouragement to us that we walk through this world and there's no temptation that is common to man, but you are faithful. You provide the way of escape. You encourage us through some of the same promises that your people have always had and relied upon. You come near to us through your presence, your spirit indwelling us. Lord, you provide for us constantly. And so we share in this long line of your care for us and moving your plan along. Lord, regardless of how prominent we become, whether it's more like an Abraham or an Isaac, we share these same blessings. What matters most about our lives is that people would say about us that you were with us, that your presence was with us, and that was evident to them. So may that be true in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thank you.